San Francisco was the kind of place that looked like a promise. In the late 1800s, the streets were busy from morning to midnight. People came from everywhere, some chasing honest work, others chasing fast money. Ships arrived heavy with goods. New buildings climbed upward. Lights from saloons and theaters made the night glow like daytime. To many, this city felt like a new beginning. But San Francisco also had a second face. It was a face that did not appear in postcards, a face that lived behind curtains, behind locked doors, and behind friendly smiles. In certain neighborhoods, rules did not come from law books. They came from whoever controlled the street, the bar, the gambling room, and the people who walked through those doors. And in one part of the city, that hidden world was not a secret. At all, it was simply business. The place was known as the Barbary Coast. The name alone sounded dangerous, like a warning. It was loud, crowded, and full of temptation. Music spilled out of saloons, dice rolled across tables, women and men sold dreams, comfort, and lies. In that district, everything had a price: food, drink, company, and sometimes a person's future. Tourists came for excitement, workers came to forget their hard days, criminals came because it was the easiest place to disappear into the crowd, and, above all of them, watching carefully, were men who did not need to shout to be heard. They only needed the right look, the right word, the right contact. On a city like this, power did not always belong to the mayor. It did not always belong to the police. It did not always belong to the richest businessmen. Sometimes power belonged to the person who knew everyone's weakness, who could turn that weakness into a favor. This is where the story of the Murphy-Dolan Gang begins. Not with a gunshot, not with a chase, but with a handshake. There was a kind of criminal in San Francisco that people did not expect. He did not wear a mask. He did not hide in dark alleys. He dressed well. He spoke calmly. He smiled at the right time. He could sit at a table with a judge one day and sit with a gambler the next. He understood something most people did not. A city runs on rules, but it also runs on relationships. And if someone could control relationships, that person could control the rules. In those days, many citizens believed the law protected them. They believed the police were there to keep peace. They believed elections decided the future. But in certain corners of San Francisco, another truth spread quietly. The truth was that law could be bent, peace could be purchased, and elections could be managed. If a saloon needed to stay open past hours, someone could arrange it. If a gambling room needed a warning before a raid, someone could deliver it. If a problem appeared in angry rival, a stubborn witness, a business that refused to pay, someone could make that problem go away. That someone was not always the man doing the work. Often, it was the man pulling the strings. This is why the Murphy-Dolan Gang became so powerful. They were not only feared, they were connected. They were organized, and they were patient. They did not build their influence overnight. They built it slowly, one deal at a time, one favor at a time, one person at a time. A policeman who needed help paying bills, a politician who wanted votes, a business owner who wanted protection, a judge who wanted support, a journalist who needed silence. Each small connection became a thread, and thread by thread, a web formed. On the surface, the city kept moving. People went to work, families ate dinner, children played, newspapers filled pages with grand speeches about progress and opportunity. But underneath, the web tightened. A man could walk into the Barbary Coast with money in his pocket and pride in his chest. He could believe he was in control. Yet by the time he left, he might be broke, ashamed, and confused about how it happened so fast. The house always won, and the house had owners. Some people tried to resist. A few honest officers tried to clean. The streets, some citizens complained. Some reformers spoke loudly about corruption. Every so often, a raid happened and the newspapers claimed that justice had arrived. But the next night, the lights turned on again. The same doors opened. The same games began. That was the strange part. It was not that crime was hidden. It was that crime was protected. Protected by fear, yes, but also by paperwork, by politics, and by the careful control of information. The Murphy-Dolan Gang became a named people, whispered because it represented something bigger than one fight or one robbery. It represented the idea that the city had a shadow government, a government that did not need votes and did not need speeches. It only needed control. Control over vice, control over money, control over the people who enforce the law, control over the people who shape public opinion. And the people at the center of this control did not look like monsters. That made them even more dangerous. Because when a threat looks like a gentleman, many people lowered their guard. In this world, power was not always loud. Often, it was quiet. It was the calm voice at a table, the envelope handed over with no witnesses, the friendly warning given just in time, the quick favor that turned into a lifelong debt. These were the building blocks of an empire. And while ordinary citizens slept, that empire grew. Soon, San Francisco would face a question it could not avoid forever. Who truly runs a city? The people who follow the law, or the people who know how to bend it? The Murphy-Dolan story is not only a crime story, it is a power story. It is about how a network can become stronger than the rules meant to stop it. And in the next part, the camera moves closer, because the story is about to introduce the kind of man who did not need a crown to be called a king, Frank King. Murphy was stepping into the center of the stage, and once he did, San Francisco would never look the same again. San Francisco did not become dangerous by accident. It became dangerous because too many people needed it to be that way. The Barbary Coast was not just a neighborhood. It was a system, a machine. It pulled people in with music and light, then emptied their pockets, and sent them back into the night with secrets they could not explain. During the day, San Francisco looked like a hard-working city. Wagons moved through the streets, docks, workers lifted heavy crates, shop owners opened their doors, families tried to build a normal life. The city was growing fast, and everyone could feel it. But when the sun went down, the rules changed. In the Barbary Coast, night was a different world. Gas lamps glowed on wet streets, loud laughter spilled out of saloons, pianists played fast songs, men gathered in groups, watching who entered, who left, and who looked like easy money. There were places where a person could drink until they forgot their own name. Places where gamblers promised one last win. Places where strangers offered friendship that lasted only as long as the cash in a pocket. And there were also people watching all of it like a business. Because the Barbary Coast did not run on chaos alone. It ran on planning. A tourist might see noise and excitement. A newcomer might see adventure, but the men in charge saw something else. They saw a steady flow of customers. They saw profit. They saw control. Every corner had a purpose. Every door had a guard. Every saloon had someone who knew the police schedule. Every gambling room had someone who could spot a rich man within seconds. In that district, the most powerful weapon was not always a fist or a gun. It was information. Who owed money, who wanted a job, who was cheating on a spouse, who was hiding from the law, who could be bribed, who could be threatened. The Barbary Coast collected that information like it collected coins. And once a person's weakness was known, it became a tool. This is why the district was so hard to clean up. Not because the city did not try, but because the people who benefited from the Barbary Coast were not only criminals. They were also people in suits. Some officials took money to look away. Some officers accepted gifts for protection. Some politicians depended on the district's votes during elections. Some business owners made profit from the crowds and did not ask questions. Corruption did not sit in one room. It spread across the city like smoke. There were honest people. Of course, there were police officers who wanted to do the right thing. There were citizens who were tired of crime. There were newspaper writers who tried to expose the truth, but honesty had a problem. Honesty could not compete with money and fear. When an honest officer planned a raid, someone often found out. When a witness agreed to talk, someone visited that witness at night. When a reformer gave a speech, someone spread rumors to destroy their name. And if the pressure did not work, then the district had other methods. A man could lose his job. A shop could be damaged. A person could be beaten in an alley. Sometimes, someone simply vanished from the story, and no one asked too many questions. That was the real power of the Barbary Coast. It did not only offer temptation, it offered consequences. A person who walked into that district entered a game. They did not understand. The rules were hidden. The winners were chosen, and the house always had allies. This is where organized crime began to evolve. In many places, criminals worked alone or in small groups. They stole, they fought, they ran, and they hid. But in San Francisco, something different was forming. A network. A network did not need to rob everyone. It only needed to collect from everyone. A little from the bartender, a little from the gambler, a little from the brothel owner, a little from the street vendor, a little from the politician. Like rain, filling a river, small payments became a powerful stream, and the people who controlled that stream gained a kind of influence that felt impossible to stop. Soon, there were names that mattered in the district. Names spoken with respect, fear, or both. Some men were known as enforcers, hard faces, who handled problems. Some were known as fixers, smooth talkers, who solved issues with a phone call, a letter, or a quiet payment. And then there were the leaders. The leaders did not stand in the street and shout. They did not waste energy on small fights. They built relationships with the right people. They gave favors. They collected debts. They understood that fear is powerful, but loyalty is even stronger when it is purchased. In the Barbary Coast, a deal could be made in a minute, but the debt could last forever. This is how a district that looked wild on the outside became controlled on the inside. It was controlled by people who treated crime like business. They tracked money. They managed risk. They punished disloyalty. They protected their investments. They made sure everyone below them understood one rule: do not bring trouble to the top. That rule kept the leaders safe. It kept them distant. It kept them clean enough to smile at the right people in daylight, and it helped them grow as the city expanded. The Barbary Coast became even more valuable. More workers arrived. More travelers came through. More money poured into the streets. More opportunities appeared for men who were willing to break laws or bend them. And in the middle of this rising storm, a certain kind of man began to stand out. A man who could walk into a crowded saloon and make the room shift without raising his voice. A man who did not need to prove his strength with violence, because his strength came from what he controlled. His name would soon be linked to the most powerful network in the district, Frank King Murphy. The Barbary Coast was ready for a ruler, and in the next part, the story moves from the streets to the inner circle, where a king learned to control the city's darkest engine without ever showing his hands. Frank Murphy did not look like a criminal. That was the first mistake people made. He was not loud. He did not brag. He did not threaten strangers in public. He wore clean clothes, spoke carefully, and listened more than he talked. In a city full of shouting men and flashing knives, Frank Murphy stayed calm and calm in a place like San Francisco. Was power. Murphy came from a world where survival required intelligence more than strength. He learned early that fists could win a fight, but words could win a future. While other men chased fast money, Murphy watched how money moved. While others picked sides, he learned how to stand between them. He paid attention. He noticed which police officers struggled to pay rent. He noticed which politicians needed support. He noticed which business owners were tired of being robbed or shut down. Most people saw problems. Murphy saw opportunities. His first real base of power was not a gang, it was a saloon. To many, it was just another place to drink and gamble. To Murphy, it was an information center. People talked freely when alcohol loosened their tongues. Deals were made over drinks. Complaints were shared in whispers. Murphy remembered everything at a man who complained about a rival today might need help tomorrow. A politician who enjoyed free drinks today might need votes next month. A police officer who looked the other way once could be trusted to do it again for the right reason. Murphy never pushed too hard. He understood timing. He believed pressure should be applied slowly, like tightening a rope 1 inch at a time. Soon, his saloon became a place where important people passed through, not because they were forced to, but because it was useful. Problems were solved there. Introductions were made there. Quiet agreements happened there. Murphy was building something bigger than a business. He was building dependence. As his influence grew, people started to come to him before problems became serious. They asked for advice. They asked for protection. They asked for help smoothing things over. Murphy rarely said no. Saying yes created debt, and debt created loyalty. That loyalty spread across the Barbary Coast. Gambling operators paid to avoid trouble. Brothel owners paid to stay open. Saloon keepers paid to be warned before raids. Each payment was small enough to seem harmless, but together they formed a steady river of money and control. Murphy did not demand obedience. He made obedience feel reasonable. This was the secret to his rise. Violence existed in his world, but Murphy kept it at a distance. He knew that blood brought attention, attention brought reformers, reformers brought investigations. Murphy preferred solutions that left no headlines. If someone refused to cooperate, they were not threatened immediately. First, business slowed. Then licenses were questioned. Then friends stopped returning calls. Pressure arrived from many directions at once. Most people broke without a single punch being thrown. Those who did not understand the warning learned soon enough that Murphy had friends who handled rougher work. He did not need to know details. He only needed results. As Murphy's power grew, his name began to change. People started calling him King Murphy, not because he claimed the title, but because others gave it to him. A king does not fight every battle. A king decides who fights them. Murphy became the man who decided. He connected criminals to politicians. He connected money to protection. He connected problems to solutions. And every connection strengthened his position. Even the police knew his name. Some respected him. Some feared him. Some quietly worked with him. When officers needed help controlling trouble in a district, Murphy could deliver calm. When politicians needed votes from certain neighborhoods, Murphy could deliver people. He was not on the government payroll. He was more valuable than that. He was a bridge between the legal world and the illegal one. Murphy understood that cities do not fall apart when criminals rise. Cities fall apart when criminals and officials begin working together. That partnership creates something stronger than law and harder to destroy. Murphy became careful with his image. He avoided obvious scandal. He donated to causes. He spoke politely in public. He let others take risks while he stayed protected. Behind closed doors, however, he was always counting favors, counting debts, counting how many people would fall if he did. By the time people realized how powerful Murphy had become, it was already too late. He was no longer just a man running vice operations. He was a system. Removing him would mean pulling out threads that held entire districts together, and systems fight back. Murphy's greatest strength was not fear, it was balance. He balanced crime and politics. He balanced kindness and pressure. He balanced distance and control. But even kings need muscle. And while Murphy built the mind of the operation, someone else would soon handle the body. Someone less patient, someone more direct, someone who made sure Murphy's quiet decisions were respected in the streets. His name was Dolan. And with Dolan at his side, Murphy's empire was about to enter its most dangerous and powerful phase. In the next part, the story turns darker because power, once secured, must be defended. Power does not stay invisible forever. Once Frank King Murphy built enough influence, his world began to change. Quiet deals were no longer enough. Too many people depended on him. Too much money moved through his hands. Too many rivals wanted a piece of what he controlled. Influence needed structure, and structure needed enforcement. This was the moment when Murphy's loose network turned into something more solid. Something people would later call the Murphy-Dolan Gang. Murphy understood a simple truth. A man who controls favors controls loyalty. But a man who controls loyalty must also control fear. Without fear, loyalty can break. Without discipline, a network falls apart. Murphy did not want chaos. He wanted order. So he began organizing his connections carefully. He separated talkers from doers. He separated business from violence. He made sure each person had a role and knew their place. At the center was Murphy himself. He did not shout commands, he suggested outcomes. He asked questions that led people to the answers he wanted. When something went wrong, he rarely showed anger. He simply adjusted the pressure around him, formed a circle of trusted men. These were not reckless criminals. They were reliable operators. Men who knew when to speak and when to stay silent. Men who understood that success came from obedience. And then there was Dolan. Dolan was not like Murphy. Where Murphy was calm, Dolan was firm. Where Murphy avoided attention, Dolan accepted it. He had the kind of presence that made people straighten their backs when he entered a room. His reputation traveled ahead of him. Dolan handled the problems Murphy preferred not to touch directly. If a gambling house refused to pay, Dolan visited. If a rival group tested boundaries, Dolan responded. If someone threatened to expose the operation, Dolan made sure the message was clear. Most of the time, the message did not need to be repeated. Murphy allowed Dolan to be visible for a reason. Fear had to have a face, and Dolan's face became that symbol. Together, they created balance. Murphy handled politicians, police contacts, and financial flows. Dolan handled discipline, enforcement, and street-level control. Each man stayed in his lane. That separation kept the organization strong and protected. Its core, this is when the operation became a gang in the true sense, not just criminals working together, but a coordinated system with leadership, roles, and rules. The Murphy-Dolan Gang began setting standards across the Barbary Coast. Protection, fees were fixed. Warnings about police raids were timed. Disputes between operators were settled internally. Random violence became bad for business, so it was discouraged. Violence now had a purpose, and purpose made it more effective. Small criminals learned quickly. If they followed the rules, they were protected. If they broke them, they were punished. Many chose obedience. The gang's influence expanded beyond saloons and gambling rooms. Labor groups felt it. Dock workers felt it. Small business owners felt it. Even people who never entered the Barbary Coast felt the ripple effect. Because when crime is organized, it does not stay contained. Money moved upward. Favors moved sideways. Pressure moved downward. Police commanders received help keeping order. Murphy's terms. Politicians received support during elections on Murphy's schedule. In return, The gang received time, space, and silence. The city began adjusting around them. What made the Murphy-Dolan gang especially dangerous was how normal it seemed. There were no public declarations, no flags, no uniforms, just men in everyday clothes doing business in plain sight. A visitor could walk through the district and never realize how controlled it was, but the people inside knew. They knew which doors were safe. They knew which words to use. They knew whose name carried weight, and that name was Murphy's. Dolan made sure it stayed that way. Fear traveled faster than truth. Stories spread. Some were exaggerated. Some were real. Dolan did not correct them. Reputation was a tool, and he used it well. Murphy watched all of this carefully. He understood that power attracts attention, and attention attracts enemies. Reformers were beginning to speak louder. Journalists were digging deeper. Citizens were growing tired of corruption. But Murphy believed he had time. The system worked. The money flowed. The city depended on the order his gang provided, even if it never admitted it. He had built something strong enough to survive press roar, so he thought. Because the more power the Murphy-Dolan gang gained, the more visible it became. And visibility is dangerous. Enemies were learning names. Connections were being traced. Whispers were turning into questions. Murphy and Dolan stood at the peak of their control, unaware that the same structure that made them powerful would also make them easier to target. In the next part, the story reaches its height. The Murphy-Dolan gang would become nearly untouchable, and San Francisco would discover what it means to live under a shadow empire. By the time the Murphy-Dolan gang reached its peak, San Francisco was no longer just a city with crime. It was a city managed by it. Most people did not see this clearly. Life went on as usual. Shops opened. Ships arrived at the docks. Workers filled the streets every morning. From the outside, the city looked busy, noisy, and alive. But beneath that movement, something had changed. Decisions were no longer made only at City Hall. They were also made in back rooms, private offices, and quiet saloons where no notes were taken and no records were kept. The Murphy-Dolan gang had become a shadow authority. For business owners in the Barbary Coast, the rules were simple. Pay on time, stay loyal, do not attract attention. In return, the gang offered protection. Police raids came with warnings. Trouble from rivals disappeared quickly. Licenses stayed valid. For many, this arrangement felt safer than the law. The police were stretched thin and often unreliable. Courts moved slowly, but Murphy's system was fast. It solved problems overnight. It punished disobedience without paperwork, and it never forgot a debt. Frank King Murphy understood that stability created acceptance. If people felt safe, they stopped asking questions. If profits stayed steady, they ignored where the order came from. Murphy encouraged calm. He discouraged street fights. He reminded his people that chaos invited reformers. A peaceful district, even a corrupt one, was easier to defend. Dolan enforced this peace in his own way. When conflicts arose between operators, Dolan stepped in. He did not argue. He listened. Then he decided. His decisions were final. Those who disagreed rarely did so twice. Stories about Dolan spread across the city. Some were exaggerated, others true. No one knew exactly what he was capable of, and that uncertainty kept people careful. Fear does not need proof when reputation does the work. The gang's reach extended far beyond vice. Dock workers paid for protection. Delivery routes were influenced. Labor disputes were settled quietly before they reached headlines. Entire neighborhoods adjusted their behavior without ever meeting Murphy or Dolan. This was the genius of the operation. The leaders stayed distant. They did not threaten shop owners personally. They did not shake down workers themselves. They allowed layers of people to handle the dirty work. Each layer protected the one above it. At the top, Murphy remained clean. He attended public events. He donated to causes. He spoke politely with officials, to outsiders. He looked like a successful businessman with strong connections. And those connections were real. Politicians depended on Murphy during elections. He could deliver votes from controlled districts. He could quiet unrest. He could fund campaigns indirectly. In return, laws were enforced selectively. Police commanders relied on Murphy to keep the Barbary Coast from exploding into violence. When order mattered, Murphy delivered calm. When a show of enforcement was needed, Murphy allowed limited crackdowns that never touched the core. Both sides benefited. And when both sides benefit, neither side once changed the gang. Also mastered silence. Witnesses were discouraged without obvious threats. Journalists received warnings disguised as advice. Editors worried about advertisers and influence. Stories were softened. Names were avoided. Truth became expensive. People learned quickly that fighting the Murphy-Dolan Gang did not always mean facing violence. Often it meant losing support, losing work, losing reputation, losing safety. Those losses could be more painful than a beating. At its height, the gang did not need to expand aggressively. The city itself fed it. New businesses entered the system automatically. New officers learned the unspoken rules. New politicians accepted help without asking to. Many questions. Corruption became routine, and routine is dangerous because it feels normal. Yet even at the peak, cracks were forming. Murphy noticed them. Public anger was growing. Reform groups were gaining strength. Newspapers outside the city began paying attention. State and federal officials were asking questions local authorities could not ignore. Murphy responded with caution. He reduced visibility. He slowed expansion. He reminded his inner circle to stay disciplined. But power creates confidence, and confidence creates mistakes. Some lower-level operators became greedy. Some enforcers acted too harshly. Some allies began believing they were untouchable. Small incidents added up. Each one left a trace. Dolan handled these problems the only way he knew, by tightening control. But control through fear can only go so far. Fear does not build loyalty forever. It builds resentment. Murphy sensed a change in the air. The city was shifting. The same people who once depended on his order were starting to fear exposure more than chaos. And that fear was dangerous. Because once fear changes sides, power begins to weaken. The Murphy-Dolan Gang stood at the height of its influence. But history rarely allows empires to rest at the top. Pressure was building from every direction, public, political, and legal. In the next part, that pressure becomes conflict. Reformers would step forward, journalists would speak louder, and the city would begin asking a question it had avoided for too long. Who was really in control? The answer would decide the fate of the Murphy-Dolan Gang and of San Francisco itself. For years, San Francisco lived with corruption the way a person lives with bad weather. People complained. Then they adapted. They learned which streets to avoid at night. They learned which doors were safe. They learned not to ask too many questions about how certain businesses stayed open, or why some criminals never went to jail. But the longer this went on, the more it changed the city's spirit. Some citizens began to feel ashamed, not just afraid ashamed that they looked at their growing modern city and realized something painful. It was being controlled by hidden hands, not only by gangs in the streets, but also by men in offices who pretended not to see, and slowly, mood began to shift. It did not happen in one day. It happened in small moments. A shop owner watched his earnings disappear into protection payments. A family lost a loved one to gambling and drink. A hard-working worker saw criminals get richer while honest people struggled. A young officer joined the force to serve the law, then discovered the law had exceptions. Each moment added weight, and eventually, that weight became a movement. Reformers started speaking louder. They were not all the same kind of people. Some were businessmen tired of being pressured. Some were religious leaders who believed the city was falling into sin. Some were journalists who wanted the truth printed. Clearly, some were politicians who saw an opportunity to rise by promising change. They shared one goal: to break the hidden power that controlled San Francisco. But they faced a problem. The Murphy-Dolan Gang was not a single building that could be raided. It was not a simple group of street criminals who could be arrested in one night. It was a network, and networks are difficult to fight because they are made of people with jobs, titles, uniforms, and respect. To beat the gang, reformers had to do more than arrest gamblers. They had to challenge the connections that protected gamblers. They had to fight the system itself. Frank King Murphy watched these changes carefully. He did not panic. Panic was for weak men. Murphy believed control came from calm thinking and slow adjustments. He had survived threats before, and he had done it by staying 2 steps ahead. When reformers grew louder, Murphy did what he always did. He adapted. He told his people to lower their profile. He reminded operators not to fight. In the streets, he discouraged public scandals. He wanted the Barbary Coast to look controlled, because a controlled district was easier to defend than a violent one. He also tightened his political connections. He made sure friendly officials stayed loyal. He reminded them quietly how much they owed him. He did not threaten them with violence. He threatened them with exposure, with lost support, with elections they could not win. Murphy understood. Politicians deeply most feared losing power more than they feared criminals. At the street level, Dolan took a more direct approach. He increased discipline. He warned smaller operators to follow orders. He punished anyone whose greed attracted attention. In Dolan's mind, the rising reform movement was not a moral problem. It was a business threat, and business threats had to be handled. But the reformers kept coming. Newspapers began printing stronger words. Some journalists stopped using careful language. They started naming corruption instead of hinting at it. Stories spread beyond San Francisco, and outside attention is dangerous because it cannot be controlled as easily. Citizens began organizing meetings. Speakers warned that the city was being stolen by vice and graft. Funds were raised. Groups formed. Public pressure grew. It became harder to pretend everything was normal. The police felt the pressure too. Some officers had lived comfortably inside the old system. Others were tired of being told to look away. A few became brave enough to talk privately to reformers. Even small leaks mattered to rent. A single honest voice could break a wall of silence. Murphy tried to seal those leaks. He offered favors to keep people quiet. He used allies to discredit reformers. He pushed friendly newspapers to call the movement naive or dangerous. He hoped the public would lose interest, as people often did. But the city's anger was different this time. It was personal. People were no longer only talking about crime, they were talking about betrayal. They believed the city had been sold. They believed the law had been used as a weapon against ordinary citizens, while powerful criminals were protected. That belief created a new kind of courage. And courage is what every hidden empire fears. Because once people stop being afraid, the illusion of control begins to break. Murphy could still pull strings. He could still influence decisions. But now each pull felt harder. Each favor cost more. Each ally needed stronger protection. The network was still powerful, but it was no longer comfortable. And then something even worse happened. Some men inside the system began thinking about their own future. They asked themselves, quietly, the question no loyal member wants to ask. What happens if the king falls? That question changed everything. Once doubt enters a network, loyalty becomes temporary. People start planning exits. They start saving themselves. They start trading secrets for safety. Murphy could feel it. Dolan could feel it too. The city was turning into a battlefield, but not the kind with open gunfire. This was a battle of pressure, reputation, evidence, and public opinion. And in this kind of battle, the strongest weapon is not a fist. It is a truth finally spoken out loud. In the next part, the conflict becomes sharper, because reformers will not stop at speeches. They will start hunting proof. And when proof begins to surface, even a quiet king like Frank Murphy can no longer stay in the shadows. Every empire believes it will fall from the outside, but most empires begin to fall from within. For the Murphy-Dolan Gang, the danger was no longer only the reformers, the newspapers, or the public pressure. The real danger was quieter and closer. It was doubt. For years, loyalty inside the network had been strong. People followed rules because the system worked. Money flowed. Protection was real. Problems were handled quickly. As long as the machine ran smoothly, few questioned who controlled it. But when pressure increased, that confidence began to fade. The first cracks appeared in small ways. A payment arrived late. A warning about a raid came too slow. A favor that once cost nothing now required more explanation. These were minor issues on the surface, but they carried a message underneath. The system was under stress. Frank King Murphy noticed these signs immediately. He had built his power by watching details, and he understood that details always speak before disasters arrive. Murphy called in trusted men. He listened carefully. He asked quiet questions. He did not accuse. Accusations created fear, and fear created mistakes. Instead, Murphy tried to restore confidence. He reminded his inner circle that reform movements rise and fall. He pointed to past attempts that had failed. He promised that the network was strong enough to survive another storm. And for some, that was enough, but not for everyone. At the lower levels, fear grew faster. Street operators saw raids happening more often. Some were arrested and not released as quickly as before. A few discovered that lawyers were suddenly less helpful. Others realized that politicians who once answered calls now avoided them, that protection felt thinner. Dolan responded the only way he knew how. He tightened discipline. He demanded faster payments. He punished mistakes more harshly. He reminded everyone that weakness invited destruction. His methods kept order, but they also spread anxiety. Fear can control behavior, but it also pushes people to protect themselves. Some operators began hiding money. Some reduced involvement. Some quietly contacted reformers or investigators, hoping to trade information for safety. They did not think of themselves as traitors. They thought of themselves as survivors. Murphy sensed this shift and felt something. He rarely felt that uncertainty. He had always believed he could manage people through balance, reward, and pressure, kindness and threat. But fear changes the rules. When people believe the future is dangerous, they stop thinking about loyalty and start thinking about escape. Murphy tried to slow the collapse. He reduced exposure further. He distanced himself from direct decisions. He allowed Dolan to take more blame publicly while he stayed in the background. But this created another problem. The more invisible Murphy became, the more people questioned whether he would protect them if things went wrong. A king who cannot be seen is easy to doubt. Meanwhile, reformers began closing in. Investigations became more organized. Evidence was collected carefully. Instead of chasing gamblers, they followed money. Instead of arresting street men, they looked at officials. And once officials felt threatened, they became unpredictable. Some tried to destroy evidence. Some lied more aggressively. Some turned on their allies to save themselves. Each reaction left traces. Murphy's strength had always been his connections. Now, those connections were becoming liabilities. Each friend in office was also a potential witness. Each favor recorded in memory could become testimony. The network that once protected him was now exposing him. Dolan noticed the change to dot the streets felt different. People talked less. Trust weakened. The usual signs of obedience were replaced by nervous glances and forced smiles. Dolan increased pressure, but pressure only revealed how close the breaking point was. Violence increased not because the gang wanted it, but because control was slipping. Smaller groups tested boundaries. Rivals sensed weakness. The order Murphy had worked so hard to maintain began to shake, and shaking attracts attention. Newspapers reported conflicts more openly. Citizens demanded answers. Public meetings grew larger. The reform movement was no longer a fringe voice. It was becoming mainstream. Murphy faced a choice. He could fight openly, using force, intimidation, and influence to crush the movement, or he could retreat, reduce risk, and try to survive quietly. Both options were dangerous. Open conflict would bring massive attention and federal involvement. Retreat would leave allies exposed and angry. Murphy chose caution. He believed time could still save him, but time was no longer on his side. The reformers had learned something important. They did not need to destroy the entire gang at once. They only needed to break trust. Once loyalty collapsed, the empire would destroy itself. And that was already happening. People were talking. People were writing. People were remembering details they once ignored. Murphy and Dolan still held power, but it felt heavier now, like a crown made of stone instead of gold. In the next part, the story reaches its turning point. Because once evidence meets courage, silence can no longer protect anyone. The fall of the Murphy-Dolan gang was no longer a question of if, it was only a question of how fast. The end did not arrive with a single arrest. It did not come with gunfire in the streets or a dramatic showdown. The fall of the Murphy-Dolan gang was quieter, slower, and far more painful for those involved. It came through exposure. By the time part 8 of this story begins, San Francisco had changed. The city was no longer willing to pretend. Public anger had hardened into demand. Reformers were no longer asking for attention. They were forcing it. Investigators learned to be patient. They stopped chasing rumors and started following patterns. They tracked money. They compared records. They listened carefully to people who were once too afraid to speak. And slowly, the picture became clear. The Murphy-Dolan gang was not just controlling crime. It was shaping decisions inside city offices. Licenses, arrests, court outcomes, and elections showed the same fingerprints again and again. This was no longer a moral argument. It was evidence, frank. King Murphy felt the pressure closing in. Meetings grew fewer. Allies became distant. Men who once needed his help no longer returned calls. The protection he had built over years began to disappear one layer at a time. Murphy did what powerful men often do. When the ground shifts, he tried to disappear without falling. He reduced his visibility even more. He avoided public places. He let intermediaries speak for him. He hoped that if he stayed quiet, the storm would pass over him. But silence only made investigators more curious. The louder the city grew, the more suspicious Murphy's calm became. Dolan, meanwhile, was losing control of the streets. Fear no longer worked the way it used to. People were scared, but now they were scared of exposure more than punishment. That shift changed everything. Some operators cooperated with authorities, others simply abandoned the business. A few tried to fight back and were quickly overwhelmed. The gang's discipline collapsed, protection payments stopped, rival groups moved in, violence increased in uncontrolled ways. What had once been an organized system turned into confusion. Order, the gang's greatest strength, became its greatest weakness when it vanished. Officials who once worked quietly with Murphy now denied knowing him. Some destroyed records, some lied openly, others decided that cooperation was the safest path. The network unraveled not from one strong pull, but from many small ones. Murphy watched his empire collapse without being able to stop it. This was the cost of indirect power. When you rule through others, you fall through others. Murphy could not defend himself publicly without drawing more attention. He could not attack reformers without confirming their claims. Every move made the situation worse. The man who once controlled, outcomes now reacted to them. Dolan faced a different fate. His reputation, once a shield, now worked against him. Enforcers are easy to identify when order collapses. Witnesses remembered, his visits, stories connected, fear became testimony. His strength could not protect him from a system that was finally moving as one dot. As trials and investigations progressed, the public learned how deeply corruption had reached. Citizens felt anger, but also embarrassment. They realized how long they had lived inside a lie, and lies are painful when they break. Murphy was never publicly crowned, and he was never publicly dethroned. His fall was a fading, a loss of relevance, a disappearance from influence. People stopped asking for his help. That was the true end of his power. The city moved on without him. New leaders promised reform. New laws were written. New faces filled offices. The Barbary Coast began to change slowly, imperfectly, but visibly. But the damage was done. Trust takes longer to rebuild than power takes to destroy. The Murphy-Dolan Gang did not vanish overnight. Pieces of it lingered. Some men adapted to the new order. Some faded into quiet lives. Some carried resentment and regret. What remained was a lesson written into the cities. Memory, power hidden too long becomes fragile. Murphy believed that staying in the shadows would protect him. For years, it did. But shadows disappear when enough light is pointed in the same direction, and for the first time in a long time, San Francisco had chosen to turn on the lights. The city was not healed, but it was awake. In the final part, the story does not end with victory or defeat. It ends with understanding. Because the Murphy-Dolan Gang may be gone, but the system that allowed it to rise left a mark, one that would shape how people understood power, corruption, and silence for generations to come. When the Murphy-Dolan Gang lost its grip, many people expected the city to feel different. Right away, they expected the streets to become clean overnight. They expected the Barbary Coast to go quiet. They expected corruption to vanish like smoke. But that is not how it works. A gang can fall in weeks. A system can take years to undo. San Francisco had lived with hidden control for so long that it had become normal. People had built their lives around it, some willingly, others unwillingly. Businesses had learned to budget for protection, payments. Officials had learned which rules to enforce and which to ignore. Citizens had learned to look away. So even after the gang weakened, the city did not suddenly become pure. It became confused. The Barbary Coast, once tightly managed, began to change in unpredictable ways. Some places closed because they could no longer survive without protection. Others tried to go legit, but their reputations stayed dark. New operators came in smaller groups, reckless groups. Men who had not learned Murphy's careful discipline. In some ways, things got worse before they got better. Murphy had always understood that chaos brings attention. That is why he controlled violence. That is why he enforced quiet order. Without him, the district lost its structure. And when structure disappears, the streets fill the empty space. Police now faced a new problem. Instead of one organized network, they faced many scattered ones. Instead of predictable deals, they faced unpredictable fights. instead of controlled vice. They faced chaos. The city had removed one shadow, but it still had darkness at the same time. Politicians who had been connected to corruption tried to clean their names. Some blamed the gang for everything. Some pretended they had been tricked. Others claimed they had been forced. But the public was no longer easily fooled. People had learned that corruption was not only about bad criminals, it was also about good citizens who stayed quiet. It was about officials who enjoyed comfort. It was about businesses that looked away as long as profit stayed steady. The city's problem was not only the gang. The problem was acceptance. This is why the Murphy-Dolan story became important beyond crime history. It showed that a city can be controlled without chains and without soldiers. It can be controlled through favors, fear, and routine. Murphy's method was not new, but he used it well. He did not build power through constant violence. He built it through dependence. He made himself useful to criminals and officials. He made himself necessary. And once someone is necessary, removing them becomes difficult. This is the quiet danger of a king like Murphy. A violent criminal can be hunted easily. People agree they are dangerous. They stand out. But a criminal who behaves like a businessman is harder to stop. He sits in normal rooms, speaks normal words, and wears normal clothes. He blends into the same world as honest men. That is why Murphy could survive for so long. When Murphy faded from power, he did not leave behind a single empty chair. He left behind habits in how people did business, how officials handled problems, and how citizens expected the city to function. Those habits were harder to remove than any gang member. Still, reform had real effects. New leaders pushed for cleaner government. Some police actions became more serious. Newspapers became bolder for a time. Citizens stayed engaged longer than usual. The city tried to rebuild trust, but rebuilding trust is slow. People who had been cheated by the system did not forget quickly. Some felt relief, others felt bitterness. Many felt a deep frustration that the gang had lasted as long as it did. And for the people who had worked inside that world, the aftermath was personal. Some men who once felt powerful now felt invisible. They had spent years collecting money and influence, only to realize it could vanish in a season. Some tried to restart in other cities. Some sank into alcoholism. Some tried to live quietly and pretend the past never happened. Dolan's kind of power disappeared faster than Murphy's. Enforcers are feared, but they are rarely respected. Once the network collapses, an enforcer becomes a man without a purpose. Without order, his reputation is just a story, and stories cannot protect a person forever. Murphy's fall was different. He had built his empire through contacts and calm control, so his collapse looked like silence. But silence can be its own punishment. A man who once had people begging for his attention now faced empty rooms and closed doors. For someone like Murphy, irrelevance was worse than prison, because his identity was power. Without power, what was he? This question became part of the city's lesson. San Francisco learned that power without honesty is unstable. It might last years, but it will always create enemies. It will always create resentment. It will always attract attention, eventually. And when the attention becomes strong enough, even the most careful king cannot hold the shadows in place. The Dolan Gang left behind a warning. A city can be rich and still be owned. A city can be bright and still be blind. A city can celebrate progress while quietly accepting corruption. And the most dangerous criminals are not always the ones who scare people in the street. Sometimes, they are the ones who smile politely and make the city believe that everything is under control. In the next and final part, the story ends with the real legacy, what this gang proved about power, and what San Francisco vowed never to forget. The story of the Murphy-Dolan Gang does not end with arrests, headlines, or broken empires. It ends with a lesson. Long after the gang faded from power, San Francisco continued to ask itself difficult questions, not just about crime, but about responsibility, not just about corruption, but about silence. Because the most uncomfortable truth was this: the Murphy-Dolan gang did not rule the city alone. They were allowed to. Frank King Murphy never marched into City Hall and took control. He was never elected. He never announced himself as a ruler. His power came from something much simpler and much more dangerous: acceptance. People accepted small favors. Officials accepted quiet deals. Citizens accepted the way things were. And each acceptance made the next one easier. Murphy understood human nature better than most. He knew that people rarely wake up one day and choose corruption. Instead, they adjust to it slowly. They tell themselves it is temporary. They tell themselves it is harmless. They tell themselves they have no choice. Over time, those excuses become habits, and habits become systems. This is why Murphy's legacy mattered more than his fall. His gang showed how a city could be controlled without force, without constant violence, and without open rebellion. It showed that power could wear a friendly face and still do harm. San Francisco promised itself change. Reform laws were written. Oversight improved. The press became more careful, at least. For a while, citizens demanded transparency. The city tried to learn from its past, but history has a quiet way of repeating itself. The Murphy-Dolan story became a warning passed from one generation to the next, a reminder taught in pieces, often softened with time. That warning was simple: when crime and politics shake hands, the public pays the price. Murphy's greatest achievement was not money or fear. It was making himself necessary. When criminals needed protection, he provided it. When officials needed control, he provided it. When chaos threatened, he provided order. But order built on corruption always collapses, because it does not belong to everyone. It belongs to those who benefit from it. Dolan's role in the story offered another lesson. Force can protect power, but it cannot create legitimacy. Fear can silence people, but it cannot earn trust. Once a system that supports an enforcer breaks, strength becomes meaningless. Murphy ruled through the mind. Dolan ruled through the fist. Both forms of power failed when the city decided to look closely, and that decision to look was the most important moment in the entire story. San Francisco did not defeat the Murphy gang with weapons. It defeated them with attention, with questions, with courage, with refusal to accept silence as normal. This is why the gang's story still matters today, not because of the crimes themselves, but because of how ordinary people allowed those crimes to continue. The Murphy-Dolan Gang teaches that corruption does not survive on fear alone. It survives on comfort, on convenience, on the belief that someone else will handle the problem. But when no one speaks, power grows unchecked. Frank Murphy believed shadows would protect him forever, and for a long time they did. But shadows disappear when enough people turn toward the light. That is the real ending of this story, not victory, not justice. Awareness. San Francisco learned that a city must constantly guard itself, not only from criminals, but from indifference. Because the greatest threat to any society is not the man who breaks the law openly. It is the man who quietly rewrites it while everyone looks away. The Murphy-Dolan Gang is gone, but the lesson remains, and it asks every generation the same question: who truly controls your city? Those who serve the law, or those who understand how easily it can be bent? That question is the final legacy of the Murphy-Dolan Gang, and it is one we can never afford to ignore.